Good afternoon or good morning. I'm Dr. Joe Johnson, and I'm a member of the board of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to join us today for the sixth part of our series, We Hold These Truths, Perspectives on Health Disparities, Racial Identities, and Cultural Humility. Now, for a little bit about myself, in addition to being a member of the Trust Board, I have a private practice in Farmington Hills, Michigan, where I provide services to children, adults, and families. I hold a master's degree in school psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Detroit. I'm a fellow of 4 APA divisions and received APA's State Leadership Award in 2017. In addition to chairing APA's task force on implementing the multicultural guidelines, I'm currently co-authoring a monograph on multicultural therapy. I recently served as secretary of the Metro Detroit Area Association of Black Psychologists, and I'm passionate about mentoring students and early career psychologists. Today's webinar, Addressing Therapeutic Cultural Avoidance, Why It Matters Now More Than Ever, is being presented by Drs. Tamar Bryant Davis and Miguel Gallardo. I want to tell you what makes them experts in this field. Dr. Bryant Davis is a licensed psychologist, professor of psychology at Pepperdine University, and director of the Culture and Trauma Research Lab. She is a past representative to the United Nations and a past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women. Dr. Bryant Davis has published and presented on the cultural context of trauma recovery, including the societal trauma of racism. She is author of the book, Thriving in the Wake of Trauma, a Multicultural Guide, and editor of the book, Multicultural Feminist Therapy, Helping Adolescent Girls of Color to Thrive. In 2020, the International Division of APA honored her for her contributions to the psychological study of women and gender with a focus on Africa and the African diaspora. Dr. Bryant Davis is also a candidate for APA president-elect with a platform of thriving in a post-pandemic world, applying psychological science to enhance people's lives. Dr. Gallardo is a professor of psychology and program director of Aliento, the Center for Latino Communities at Pepperdine University. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and maintains an independent consultation practice at the Neurobehavioral Clinical and Counseling Center, where he conducts therapy, forensic legal psychological, and neuropsychological screening assessments, and consults with organizations and universities on developing culturally responsive systems. He teaches courses on multicultural and social justice advocacy and professional practice issues. Dr. Gallardo's area of scholarship and research interests include understanding the psychotherapy process when working with ethnocultural communities, particularly Latinx communities, and in understanding the processes by which individuals develop cultural awareness and humility. Dr. Gallardo has published several refereed journal articles, books, and book chapters in areas of multicultural psychology, Latinx psychology, ethics and evidence-based practices, cultural humility, and racial colorblindness. He also regularly discusses issues relevant to understanding how we develop stronger relationships with one another in his Cultural Humility podcast. We are indeed fortunate to have both of these experts with us today. We also need to let you know that our presenters have declared that they have no conflicts of interest. Here are our learning objectives. Objective 1, to define cultural avoidance and cultural engagement. Objective 2, describe the costs of cultural avoidance. Objective 3, describe 3 ways to engage culture in therapy. We know that clinicians over the years may have shied away from addressing these issues because they haven't been taught the importance of doing so, or maybe they feared doing so for lack of knowledge. So we trust that this workshop is going to provide you with the appropriate information and the appropriate courage to do so. So I would like now to turn our discussion over to our experts. And we will begin with Dr. Gallardo.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. By the way, the pronunciation of my last name was absolutely beautiful. Sounded great. Thank you. It brought a smile to my face. So I appreciate that.
Very good.
Good morning and good afternoon to those listening. I know you're all over the place, all over the country at this moment in time, and so happy to be here. I'm also doing well because I'm thriving with Tama, and anytime I'm thriving with Tama, my energy is better, and I'm doing well. And so when I get to share space with Dr. Bryant Davis, it's always a real treat for me personally, and I know it's going to be a real treat for all those listening today. Before I launch into really the meat of my my part of the presentation, and what I'm going to try to do is really lay a groundwork, a foundation, kind of define some things, really talk about the importance of why we need to be addressing cultural issues in our work. And then Dr. Brian Davis is going to come in and really provide some more practical, I think, tools and some skills to think about how to do that and what that can look like. When we, you know, this is the second time Dr. Brian Davis and I are sharing space here with the trust and doing a training, and as a result of our first one, we got some feedback about some things that folks wanted us to talk about, you know, the next time we did this, if you will. And one of the topical areas was the topic of cultural blindness. And so that's where we ended up. And I'm bringing that in because I want to provide a little bit of context of why we decided to massage our language a little bit, and really be kind of more thoughtful and intentional about the language that we use. As we were thinking about this idea of cultural blindness, was just reminded of I think even the term blind and blindness are really I think misused a lot. And as I think about individuals with disabilities and the disabilities communities, I always think about just thinking of intentional about the language that we use. You know, look, I've done some work with racial color blindness ideology, or colorblind racial ideology. And when we were doing some of that work in the past, we got some feedback from folks that said, you know, that from the disability community, that, you know, to be mindful of how we're talking about and using the words and the language. And so it has stuck with me. And it's one of those situations where, you know, the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know at times, or the more you realize we can take things for granted. And so ever since then, I appreciate that feedback, you know, years ago. So I've been really thoughtful and mindful about my use of language and our use of language. And so, and when you think about it, if you know someone who might be blind or legally blind or have some kind of visual impairment of some kind, you know, they're frequently more alert and more attentive than most of us sighted folks, actually. And so I think we tend to use the term blind to sort of be unaware and to lack cognizance at times, or to be ignorant about something. And so we decided that we wanted to sort of change that to cultural avoidance, to be mindful, respectful, and intentional in the language that we're using. And I'm not suggesting we can't use those terms, but I think we need to, you know, the language that we use, I think, really does a lot in terms of what we communicate, what we convey, what people understand, et cetera. So I want to give that context as we start and as we launch, you know, today's present webinar today. The slide on that we have here, you know, never, by William Ogburn, never look for a psychological explanation unless every effort to find a cultural one has been exhausted. And this really, I think, resonated with us for a lot of different reasons, because I think part of our challenge is that we tend to start with that more clinical framework, and then we add in the cultural pieces as necessary or as needed, and maybe not even at all sometimes. And I think I've said this before, and you'll hear me say it again probably a few times this morning or this afternoon for some of you. If we started with a cultural lens, if we started with cultural frameworks first and foremost, and we started there and then and built from there, I think our work would look a little bit different. How we interpret things, how we understand things, how we make sense of things looks different, and then we adapt and utilize the psychological, clinical, therapeutic principles that we have to fit into those cultural frameworks. And so I think this really, for us, really lays the foundation. This is I always use this, and this actually the DSM-5 even has more information about this, but I use this one with some level of intentionality because this is in our DSM, and again, as I mentioned, the DSM-5 even has more, I think, more substance to this. As with each new edition, there's more information around the important role of culture and cultural lens and cultural worldviews. And so this is from the DSM-4TR. A clinician who is unfamiliar with the nuances of an individual's cultural frame of reference may incorrectly judge as psychopathology those normal variations in behavior, beliefs, or experience that are particular to the individual's culture. And and what I find, why I use this is because I feel like our DSM, much like our ethics codes, continues to be implemented with some level of fidelity to, I think, the criteria, with some level of fidelity to the what's laid out in the documentation and following. And while I think, and we know, even if we think about with fidelity, even if we look at empirically supported treatments, we know that those need to be adapted. So implementing with fidelity and with no adaptation, we know can do some cultural harm. Good, well-intentioned therapists, clinicians can unintentionally violate folks. And so when I think about the DSM, I think the DSM has continued oftentimes to be used in a way that I think is incongruent at times, and it doesn't have to be. I've always said this, we don't have to get rid of all these things. We just have to change the way in which we interpret them, understand them, and apply them oftentimes. And so there are still people today who look at the DSM-5 and have no idea of the cultural formulation interview and information that I think is very helpful and very useful as a framework for understanding one's client. And so I think as we think about this, it's embedded in everything that we're doing, but are we attending to it? Are we paying attention to it? And I worry sometimes that we're not. So we also wanted to give a little bit of a framework here. I think oftentimes culture, race, ethnicity, all those terms, those concepts are used interchangeably oftentimes. Even today, when you look at literature and research, we still see those terms being used in some ways that I think aren't always the most accurate representation of what the author might be intending to communicate or convey. And so we have to be careful, because I think if we're solely relying on race and or one's physical attributes to sort of really truly tell us everything that we need to know about who someone is, that can mislead us to misunderstandings, and again, unintentionally, I think, violating at times those who we're working with. And so we have to expand that. I think our definition of culture beyond just race and ethnicity. And so culture refers to the shared meanings that people interacting within a specific context or group have of themselves and of their world. I like that definition by my colleague and friend Martin Laroche, and he talks a lot about this. And what I would say is that culture changes as people change. So does our culture. None of us have inherited the cultures of our ancestors entirely. There have been aspects, but it has evolved and is continuing to evolve. The culture today that we exist in will not be the culture 10, 20 years from now. There's going to be adaptations and evolutions. And so culture is those shared understandings and the way that looks like in our relationships with each other, our understanding of ourselves and the context in which we find ourselves at times. And so I think unintentional violations, as I mentioned, can occur when we might mistakenly impose these cultural stereotypes that we think that we might be operating from, even being unaware of it, as a way of being culturally responsive or culturally humble in our work together. And so with clients. And so if we think about this idea of cultural avoidance in many ways, I want to just briefly define that. And so I think it's been defined, well, cultural blindness, but I'm going to use cultural avoidance. Cultural avoidance in many ways is providers who assert that race and ethnicity and culture more broadly really are not important in how we deliver services. And so what happens is that we end up trying and attempting to provide services through a more mainstream, traditional, dominant cultural approach to everyone the same, as if we're all the same, ignoring cultural strengths, individual strengths, uniqueness of ethnically and racially diverse individuals, women, class issues, whatever it may be. And I think what happens is it leads to this sort of like forced therapeutic assimilation at times, with unintentional blame being placed on the individuals that we're working with rather than the society for some of the existing problems that someone might be experiencing. So we might over pathologize, we might unintentionally blame the individual. And I think we have to reframe our concepts a little bit to think about, maybe it's our systems that aren't always well, that are sick, that are pathological, and not the individuals that we're working with. And I think if we're thinking about that from a cultural framework, that helps us reframe that in some ways. And so we want to really today encourage folks to explore the client's cultural identity in a more complex manner. So here's just a couple of examples. I love these examples because they really talk about the intersectionality and the nuances and the complexity of culture. But these two examples, I think, highlight that. So lower income Asian American woman experiences of familial stress in San Diego might have certain elements in common with how a lesbian Italian American experiences familial stress in Iowa, but not have much in common with how another Asian American woman might experience familial stress in New York. Context, geography, gender, ethnic background, sexual orientations, gender expression, etc. All those sociocultural identities coming together. The second one, a fourth generation Latino American man growing up in Texas may share something in common with a young Latina American lesbian living in Los Angeles and a young Iberian mother who just immigrated to New York City. As a group, these three may also share something in common with a Chinese American gymnast who is an atheist living in Des Moines, Iowa, or with a disabled 10-year-old Chinese American girl growing up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so I think just a couple of examples to highlight how important it is that we're centralizing culture in our work. So I want to talk a little about the therapeutic content versus the therapeutic process. A couple of our colleagues worked on this some time ago. I think how they talked about it was really so relevant. The content versus process model of cultural responsiveness. So a process model of cultural responsiveness is less prone to cultural stereotypes than a content model, which emphasizes cultural characteristics that are salient for culturally different groups. So in other words, relying on some of those, looking at a chapter on African Americans or Latinx communities or the book and using that as your primary guide, while that's important, and it's a both and in how we gather and understand information, I think we have to look at that information and that content, knowing that it's a starting point, but there's limitations to the application of it. If we go back to some of the things I've already mentioned, there are some, this is what this looks like within cultural communities is going to vary, is going to look a little bit different. But I think having that information is important. Knowing the information is important, but also recognizing that there might be some limitations to that information. That's the content model. The process model is defined as healthcare professionals continually striving to achieve the ability and availability to effectively work within the cultural context of a client. I like that. The ability, so our abilities, it's not some destination we arrive to, but something that is continuously evolving and that we're continuously learning and growing from. Every encounter is an encounter with knowledge. And then the availability. So making sure that we are always aware of how we're entering in, our positionality, our location in entering into the relationships, entering into the context, entering into the therapeutic domain, if you will, and being aware of that as we're working within the context of the client's life and the multiple contexts in which they exist in. And so it's about becoming culturally responsive, not being culturally responsive or culturally humble, if you will. And so many providers often tend to see cultural responsiveness as a distinct set of skills rather than an integrated component of clinical care and consumer and client management. So I think those are helps distinguish this a little bit for us. So culturally humble therapeutic practice, I think probably over the last almost 10 years or decade or so, and Tervalon and Garcia Murray, even before that, talked about cultural humility. But I think over the last decade or so, it's really gained a lot more momentum and salience in the literature and also in our conversations. And so as we're thinking about these issues, there's been a lot of good research published, and Mosher and colleagues have talked about that the utility of competence-based models may be limited when addressing the intersectionality of marginalized identities. So I think, to put that more plainly, the more structured, the more we rely on a set of standards or models, the less flexibility I think we implement, the less creativity I think we implement. And I think that scares people sometimes. I think that worries some people. But for those of you who've been out practicing and doing this for a while, you know that the longer you do this, there are certainly some black and whites, but there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of gray. And so I think that evolution in our comfort in knowing what that looks like for us as therapists, I think it is so crucial. But I worry a little bit about our reliance on competency-based models too much, because I think it stifles our availability at times to truly be there, to lean in, our flexibility at times, our creativity at times, and I think all those are necessary to do this work. And now, today, at this moment in time, and then going forward, it's here to stay. I mean, I think I'm hoping that this is a turning point in our society, and not something that's just temporary and then a return to what once was, because that's not going to work. I don't think that's going to be allowed at this moment in time. And so going forward, this is essential ethical practice for us. Hooks and colleagues found that clients who perceive their therapist to be higher in cultural humility are also reported stronger working alliances with their therapists and greater improvements in therapy. Hook developed a cultural humility rating scale that I think is a nice tool to use as well, and that's what that information is based off of. Hooks also found that 81% of a large racial ethnic minority sample of clients experience at least one racial microaggression in counseling, including slights such as bias, denial, or lack of awareness of stereotypes, and avoiding the discussion of cultural issues. And really, I think there's a big avoidance of discussion of racial issues at times in therapy. And it could be other things. I think also sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, those issues are also sometimes make us uncomfortable and uneasy at times. And so, it's like this idea of saying, like, I don't see color, we're all human. Look, I'm not going to argue with you that we're all human, but our lives aren't all the same. And so in some ways, I get the good, well intent in saying that, but I also want to just encourage folks that really sort of melds everyone into sort of one when and invalidates our uniqueness, our differences, my own worldviews, which are different from yours, that have impacted how I see the world, how I understand the world. Nothing is value free. Everything is value laden. This presentation is value laden with Dr. Brian Davis and I experiences, our context, our multiple contexts, our identities, our positionality, where we're located, how we understand things, where we go get information, how we interpret that information, how we put it back out in a presentation like this. So it doesn't mean it's less valid, less reliable, less legitimate, but it's not value free. And so I think when we rely on this neutrality in our work at times, I think we're maintaining the status quo, and I'm not always sure that that's the best thing for the folks that we're working with and trying to help. And so Davis and colleagues found that clients are regularly assessing the safety of the counseling relationship, and that any kind of microaggression may disrupt that sense of safety. Those biases, being unaware of how we might be coming across, what we might be saying, which can cause clients to alter their view of the relationship and also of who we are as therapists. If we don't recognize when that's happening and try to do something to repair it, look, we're all going to stumble and fall. It's going to happen. I still stumble and fall. And yet I have to figure out how to understand that, recognize that, and then try to repair that in many ways. And so if we don't repair it, it can result in a continued cycle in which the behavior indicating a lack of humility causes a deterioration in the working alliance, which can eventually lead to early termination, poor therapeutic outcomes, et cetera. So I just want to quickly define cultural, psychotherapy. So, I think when we think about this universalist psychotherapy, it's what I talked about earlier. Interventions that view all individuals as sharing similar characteristics, and the cultural aspects are secondary. So, and then we may refine our strategies or how we understand or do something based on what someone's presenting with. But there's an assumption that depression is depression no matter where it is seen, that resistance is resistance no matter how it comes across, that resistance is resistance no matter what it looks like. And I think that's where the concern is. Western psychological theories and concepts can hardly be treated as universal in as much as they are products of a specific set of social, structural, and historical circumstances and accompanying assumptions, culture bound, and there's limitations there. Doesn't mean we get rid of it altogether, but we have to understand that when applying it. Racial and ethnic models are cultural adaptations, are these research and treatment models that include the effects of race and ethnicity in their formulation, which encourages the development of interventions that are more consistent with diverse racial and ethnic groups, but often include only minor modifications of the intervention. So matching clients with therapists who have similar ethnic background or language preference, etc. Still some limitations there. So cultural psychotherapy, as defined by LaRoche, emphasizes the need to measure cultural variables, levels of perceived discrimination, gender roles, etc. How does religion, age, gender, ethnic identity, etc. impact clients' manifestation of symptoms? A lack of global/cultural awareness can lead us to endorse social scripts that are based on socially constructed realities and potentially replicate those cultural stereotypes or assumptions, even when they may not apply and may be ineffective at times. So psychological processes are embedded in historically varied and culturally mediated activities. Every human being is part of a cultural system. Everyone has a racial story. And so we should be thinking about all clients that we work with from this lens. Cultural similarities between clients and interventions we know increase psychotherapy effectiveness. Helms has argued that when ethnic racial issues are the primary variables, by default, other cultural variables are assumed to be homogeneous, discounting the within group variation while assuming that all individuals within one racial ethnic group benefit from an intervention designed for that group. So we can't just base it on the racial or ethnic identification. We know that that can be helpful and that it has been helpful, but we have to continue to expand that and think about the other cultural variables. So most therapists can address the importance of individual and relational factors, but lesser aware of the contextual factors that many clients, particularly BIPOC clients, are experiencing: discrimination, community violence, etc. So sometimes we've known from the literature and just in work is that the cognitive match may prove to be more therapeutic at times than just solely an ethnic match with the clients, okay? So it's important to understand, as I mentioned, that our interventions are not value-free. Let me stop this. It's my timer. I'm getting down to time. Thank you. It's important to understand that psychotherapy interventions are not value-free, and that there are cultural assumptions in the interventions that we often may use: individualism, heterosexism, etc. It's important to underscore that each individual or group have specific cultural characteristics that may vary by racial or ethnic designation. We should measure all of these and understand these when we're understanding the usefulness of what we're attempting to do with our clients. There are greater differences between identified cultural assumptions of an intervention and the cultural characteristics of an individual or groups targeted. And when that happens, it suggests a greater need for the cultural adaptation. Cultural psychotherapy can also imply culturally grounded bottom-up approaches. And for years, a lot of ethnic specific organizations, like for example, ABPSI, has been documenting and the utility and the effectiveness of interventions that work with African Black communities. And yet mainstream associations, even like the APA at times, have discounted and not determined those to be empirically supported, evidence-based, et cetera. I think some of that's evolving, but we still have a ways to go. And so who has the power to define what works with whom and under what circumstances? And that's the $64,000 question. So why this matters, this is my last slide. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Brian Davis. The ethical position of most forms of psychotherapy assumes that the active participation of a client family, no matter how determined or restricted in their freedom we have conceptualized them to be. There's this assumption that people are going to come to a place they've never been before, talk to someone they've never met before, and just disclose and openly talk about, what's going on and what's the issue, what's the problem. That doesn't sound appealing to a lot of people. And then once people are there, I think we have assumptions about what the role should be. And that's also going to vary. That's also going to look different in our work with clients. Ultimately, the very social issues that are relevant to the health and well-being of our clients are background noise and tend to be excluded as legitimate forms of professional intervention. Pac-Man calls these second-class interventions. We need to move those up to first class, to primary, to the primary, if you will, not the secondary or the tertiary. Contextualizing an individual or family's current challenges within the larger cultural and historical context, and also understanding the theories and the interventions we're using brings integrity to the healing process. Seeing the connection between the individual and family, their problems in the larger social cultural context, helps the client, the family, understand that they're part of a larger network of systemic, multiply oppressive systems. And that also relieves some of the burden that they feel of individual pathology. When we assume that the individual is the sole bearer of responsibility for what they're experiencing, we are reinforcing society's mental health status quo. And we have to think about the challenge in that, the unintentional violation and oppression we can do in our good, well-intentioned work at times. And so liberation psychology, which Dr. Brian Davis is going to address in just a few moments, talks about that, and I think illustrates that. So we have to reinforce that wellness occurs in community and not only within the individual. And so we don't want to reinforce society's health status quo, which I think oftentimes we may unintentionally do. I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Dr. Bryant Davis now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that rich presentation and laying the groundwork for us. I'm so appreciative that each of you are here on today and so grateful for the trust for creating this space. Cultural engagement, we want to think about moving from awareness around culture to really working toward liberation in our therapeutic practice, for us to understand fundamentally that justice is therapeutic, that it is not just about an individual shifting their psychology, but for us also applying our psychology to empower people and organizations to shift toward equity, toward justice, toward inclusion. I'm so grateful that you're here. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Black woman, and it is important that I identify myself, and also to note that as a psychologist, I'm a practitioner, a researcher, a consultant, and an educator. I'm also a mother, an activist, an artist. And sometimes we have these colonial notions of singularity. That means to be a professional is to erase yourself. And I want us to be mindful as practitioners that we show up with the fullness of our identity, and that is not a stumbling block, that is a gift to your practice. And as we are teaching our graduate students and supervising our students, we try to talk about, as you are learning these theories and practices, to think about integrating them in such a way that it shows up through your authentic self. I want to give a land recognition that I'm speaking to you today from Los Angeles, which is the land that has been cultivated and taken care of and protected by the Tongva people, who have been the original stewards of this land. And it's important to recognize their history, culture, contributions, and violations past and present. It's also important as we attend to the margins that it not just be symbolic, but that in our practice, in our policies, in our personal lives, that we stand for justice and for equity. I want to acknowledge that we are meeting at this time during a socio-political climate of hostility, instability, and overt oppression in our local communities, in our nation, and globally, while we are also meeting during this time of a pandemic. And I know, particularly as practitioners, we can become so focused on taking care of others that we lose sight of ourselves. And so I encourage us, even in this moment, to attend to your breath, to attend to your body, to attend to your emotions, that we are not just here in service of our clients or our communities and organizations, but that we are worthy of care and breath ourselves. I want to also name that oppression is not just something that happens out there in the world, but it happens in here, that we can promote oppression in our psychotherapeutic interventions and in our assessment through erasure, invisibility, and also by applying interventions that were created without people in their context in mind. And so we want to be attuned that we are not only equipping clients to address oppression out in the world, but we want to be mindful about the ways in which our training may have even prepared us to promote those same ideas of denial. I want to name openly that I resist and reject the myth of neutrality, that all practitioners and researchers and educators and clients are experiencing life through their lens, through their framework, through their identities. And that helps us to bring meaning to our research, teaching, and practice. And it also allows us to bring an urgency to the work that we do. As a result of what you have seen in your family, in your community, in your own life, you can show up to this work with a greater commitment to addressing cultural oppression and affirming cultural identity. So there are some foundational constructs that I want to make sure that we are all aware of. And with that in mind, I want to name that cultural oppression is bigger than bias. Cultural oppression is bigger than bias. We often think of biases as attitudes held by an individual toward other individuals. And if it was merely that a few people have a bias against me or against you, we could just try to avoid those people who don't like us. But we want to name that cultural oppression is systemic, and it is protected and maintained by power and privilege. And so when we are working with our clients, whether children, adolescents, or adults, we want to be mindful of that as people are navigating these systems, that it is not just about teaching them not to care that some people don't like them, but recognizing that these forms of oppression can affect their education, affect their housing, affect their employment, affect the media that they consume, the ways in which they are treated even by political leaders. And so we want to be mindful of also intergenerational trauma or historical trauma of oppression, that many times we are screening people for forms of trauma such as sexual assault and child abuse and partner violence, but many have not begun routinely asking questions about people's experience of oppression within their family and the stories that they grew up hearing and the awareness that they have as a result of this transmission of trauma. And there is wonderful research on the ways in which trauma can get passed down from generation to generation. I want to also name that it is important to be specific when we are talking about a specific form of oppression. So for example, sometimes people will shy away from the words racism or transphobia or ableist practice. And so we want to think of things globally, but also when you are addressing a particular issue within yourself or with a client, to be willing to name it. And we are very much aware during these times, in particular, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, gendered racism, the treatment of Black, Indigenous people of color who are immigrants, those who are LGBTQ, the realities of religious intolerance, and we want to name anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and the ableist ways in which we can set up our practices and engage in our interventions that can really be acts of erasure. So when we're working with clients and thinking about the impact of cultural oppression, it's important that we give people language and space to be able to acknowledge and identify the ways that cultural oppression has affected them psychologically, physically, cognitively, relationally, and even spiritually. So clients may show up with depression, anxiety, anger, and we want to destigmatize anger and note that it is a healthy response to be outraged about outrageous things. Let me say that again. It is a healthy response for your client to hold outrage about outrageous things. It is simply for us to think about what we do with that outrage as opposed to pathologizing it. We're also aware that people may show up with post-traumatic stress symptoms that may be affected in terms of their trust of yourself and trust of others. Along those lines, being aware of internalized oppression, when people come to believe the negative things they have been told about their community, suicidal thoughts, substance dependence, fatigue, and dissociation. And along with fatigue, I want to name racial battle fatigue, when people are living or working in environments where there is pervasive racism. If you are a marginalized community member, it can be exhausting. And this month, we are in Pride Month. And so we also want to be aware of the realities of heterosexism and homophobia and how exhausting it can be to work through those on a daily basis. It can also show up with your clients having imposter syndrome, a sense of not belonging. And many critics of imposter syndrome have named the importance of us identifying that imposter syndrome does not just originate in the person. It is not merely a psychological problem of this person having low self-esteem, but in actuality, often being environments, living and working environments where they are made to feel like they do not belong, or like they are not included, or like they are not welcome. And so being one of the only women in a predominantly male workplace, being the only person of your nationality or race on your campus, in a class, in a work setting, all of these pieces can have an impact. Your clients may have difficulty concentrating, remembering, or focusing. They may have diminished resource access. And so it is not merely excuse making or playing the race card. This has been documented that when people turn in the same application for a job, identical qualifications, and you simply change the name to a Black sounding name, the person with the Black sounding name is less likely to even be called in for an interview, right? And so when people come in with the hardship of that, with the pain of that, we need to be able to create a safe space, a sanctuary where that is honored and heard. It also has physical health consequences, more likely to die as a result of COVID-19 and other complications, injury, infection, cardiovascular disease, respiratory system failure. We have higher rates of maternal death and complications during birthing. It also can affect relationships. So broken trust in systems, professional relationships, relationship with the government, and personal relationships as well. So it is not only an internal process of healing people's trust by calling it trust issues, but looking at the ways in which the trust has been broken and violated. There has also been given growing attention to spiritually integrated psychotherapy, and we want to be mindful of the spiritual effects that some people experience: a loss of faith, a change of faith, or an intensifying of their faith as a result of trying to hold on to hope in very trying and toxic circumstances. So as practitioners, we want to hold space for the strength and the sorrow. Lucille Clifton, an African-American poet, said, "Come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And every day, not only have we had threats to our physical safety, but also our cultural identity, our human dignity. And so to still be present, to still attempt to flourish, to not only survive, but thrive, is an act of defiance." And the Mexican proverb, which reads, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." And so we want to name and be aware of in our practice the realities of oppression, but that is not the end of the story. There is more to culture than cultural oppression. There is more to race than racism. There is more to gender than sexism, right? So we want to be able to hold the full breadth of our experience. And many of us err on one side or the other. Either we want to just idealize it and have trouble giving space for the pain of people's experience, or we only recognize the pain and don't understand the beauty, the strength, the glory of people's cultural heritage. So I want to say to you very clearly that culture is also a resource. And some have talked about culture as medicine. In Chicano affirmative therapy, there is really a foundational piece that for people to come to a positive sense about themselves and about their culture is therapeutic. And so we do not only inherit the wounds of intergenerational trauma, but we also inherit the wisdom of those who come before us. And there is a need for us as psychologists to really operate with more humility. Many times there is this arrogance that can exist in the field where people will even say, if you've never been to therapy, you haven't done any work on yourself. Or if you haven't been to therapy, you don't know yourself. And we want to really get into a place of humility to know that the field of psychology is very young. And long before therapy, as it is known in our tradition, was ever created, there were ways in which, cultural ways in which people healed, restored, explored, identified, affirmed, connected, reconnected with themselves. And so to encourage clients to be able to learn about their cultural wisdom, to honor their language as opposed to being ashamed of it, to honor the art and using our expressive arts in treatment, to honor spirituality and religiosity. It's important to know that the people of color and women are more likely to endorse spirituality and religiosity. And so when our practice ignores, diminishes, or pathologizes faith, we want to know who exactly that has a disproportionate impact on. We also want to think about interconnectedness as an asset. We often will talk about enmeshment or the problem of family or cultures being involved in people's decision-making, but not seeing it as a resource of what has happened in order for there to be collaboration and for there to not just be self-care, but community care and mutual care and social support, for our clients to begin to think about what are the strategies that they and their family, their cultural community members have utilized in order to survive. And so code switching is a skill, the ability to navigate waters and communication within your community. And then when you're in other communities, to be able to shift, sometimes even without your own awareness. And the challenge becomes when it is required for people to leave themselves behind versus there being multiple ways in which we are ourselves, yes? We also want to think about culturally the different healing remedies that people have utilized and discovered. And so it is really rich. It was amazing to me, this research that is now being done around the vagus nerve and finding how not only is breath important to us being able to stabilize ourselves, but they even have research that shows that humming is helpful. And when I read that, I had to laugh to myself because I thought about older Black women in my tradition sitting, humming, and rocking, right? Without any grants, without any funding, without any blind studies, but being able to know and discover culturally what are the things that are soothing. And so Indigenous healing is also important for us to think about and to be mindful of being respectful and acknowledging and encouraging people connecting with their traditions without us appropriating people's traditions. So keys to engagement from a liberation psychology standpoint is to think about not just working towards symptom cessation. If a client is no longer suicidal or cutting, that is progress, but that is not the end of the story. We want to think about not only survival, but people have a right to access of thriving, of fulfillment, of being the fullness of who they are. So we want to encourage empowerment, healing, growth, and transformation. We want to attend to psychological and systemic factors. We want to be very much aware of discrimination and inequality and help our clients to think about responding to their experiences with stigma and stereotype, not only with emotional coping, but problem-solving coping and engagement in anti-oppression organizations or efforts. We want to help build on people's strengths and identify those strengths. We want to affirm cultural identities, even for people who grew up not being aware of their cultural identity. So sometimes we assume if it's not important to them, it's not a factor. But some people were adopted and raised by persons who are not from their same cultural heritage, or in order to survive, their parents told them to erase that part or didn't teach them that part of themselves. And so there can be a sense of disconnect. And so reconnecting, choosing to learn more about who they are, can be a real source of empowerment and therapeutic growth. So when you engage, you want to ask about experiences of culture and oppression at the assessment phase. You also will be able to enter into those conversations when people present it, but you don't want to wait for them to bring it up before you name it and ask questions routinely. You also want to pay attention to nonverbal communication and attend to what are major events that are happening in the world that specifically are addressing or affecting members of that community, to be able to ask about it. And the worst that can happen is the person say, oh, I didn't really think about it. And then there is no harm in you naming it and asking the question. To be able to incorporate proverbs, cultural sayings, to ask the client if there are any role models from their cultural tradition that they really look up to. We want to address internalized oppression, integrate spirituality. For those of you who have a particular orientation, to look at the cultural modifications for CBT, for DBT, for EMDR, for psychodynamic practice. And so what does it look like to integrate these, and also to learn about culturally based or culturally emergent interventions that have come from the community themselves. Testimonials is one example of a liberation psychology practice, and it comes from a narrative perspective. So it encourages people to tell their stories, both the positive experiences with their culture, as well as experiences of cultural oppression. So you can start with a mindfulness activity and then allow them to write about their story, or they can use artwork to tell the story. They can attend to what it was like for them to reflect on their experiences, positive and negative, of culture and cultural oppression. And you can also make decisions about if you want to share a part of your story as well. And to know that self-disclosure, when it is done intentionally and carefully and respectfully, can deepen the therapeutic rapport. So we want to have socially conscious therapeutic practice and attend to power, oppression, intersectionality, the multiple identities of oppression that people may hold. You also want to ask questions about acculturation and assimilation demands that have been made in their workplace, by their family, by dating partners. We want to embrace the complexity of our identities and experience. And we also have to recognize ourselves. We often want to skip over our individual experience and think about, what do I need to do for quote unquote these people? But the first thing that we need to do is to be mindful of who we are when we show up in a space, and to search our own hearts and our own minds for the isms and for oppression, for the ways in which we have been taught knowingly and unknowingly. So to decolonize our therapeutic practice is to pay attention to poverty, gentrification, displacement, finance, to pay attention to oppression, and to also pay attention to culture as resource. We also want to be mindful of helping clients to connect to the dismissed parts of themselves and to recognize their strengths individually and collectively, and to affirm that this is not just therapeutically interesting, or it is not just my agenda. We have to ask ourselves the question, do we believe that holding oppression is psychologically healthy? And if we affirm that it is not healthy, to avoid it is unethical. To avoid it is unethical. And so I encourage you to work with your clients in thinking about not only what they want to be liberated from, but what they want to be liberated to. That what will it mean? What will it look like for you to be free to express the fullness of your identity? And so we want to decolonize our practice, to decolonize even ourselves, that we don't have to show up being blank slates, that we don't have to be unaffected by the world and by the stories that our clients share, but for us to bring our humanity in the space, that I can have joy in my practice, that as a practitioner, I can know I am deserving of rest, for me to know that it is therapeutic for my client to know that I hear and am moved by their experience? And how do we continue doing this work? Because it is a marathon and not a sprint. We want to celebrate our wins as we make progress in this work, to celebrate our wins in practice within ourselves and within the world around us. I'm excited about what we can achieve when we are willing to name and address oppression and affirm the richness and beauty of culture. Thank you so much for having us.
I want to thank the two of you. This has just been a tremendous experience, and it gets richer with each time. We are just privileged to have the benefit of all of your knowledge and experience. And naturally, we've got a number of questions that people have because you've pricked their brains and their hearts. A couple that I want to share with you. Let's start with Dr. Gallardo and your references to Latinx versus Latino, Latina. Do you have a preference?
I do, and I have to be careful because I use Latinx actually in everything that I do at this point, because I think it is important to really expand our notion of who we're talking about, and to be inviting to, I think, folks who haven't felt acknowledged and validated through our historical use of the term Latina, Latino. In Spanish, when it's a group of men and women together, we tend to use the masculine, like ellos, like all of them, and the O is masculine, and obviously the A. So I prefer Latinx. I'm working on changing the center's name and the program's name to Latinx, but as many of you may know, being in a system, there are a lot of hoops and hurdles to jump through in that process. But I prefer Latinx, and I use that almost exclusively at this point. I think it's important to let people, use the term that they think is meaningful for them. To me, it's important to use that because it really takes into consideration the gender identity and expression that I think we haven't always encompassed in our language. So.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Brian Davis, are somatic and physical wounds the same?
No, thank you so much for that question. And so we have racially and ethnically marginalized people are more likely to have somatic complaints as a result of our distress and our tension. And so a somatic complaint is a physical symptom that doesn't actually have a medical explanation. And so sometimes community members will say, I'm not stressed, but I get migraines. Or they'll say, I'm not anxious, but I'm nauseous. We also have a lot of backache in our community, and you want to wonder, like, what is it that we're carrying on these backs? And so muscle ache, grinding our teeth at night. So this stress can show up in the body. And then there can also be physical health consequences as a result of our experiences with racism and stress, where the actual infection, disorder, organ failure can be related to being depleted over time. And also it can be related not only to stress, but health disparities in our treatment. One of the heartbreaking examples that came up this past year was the pain report of people coming in with COVID-19 being dismissed when it was racial or ethnically marginalized persons reporting their symptoms. And long before COVID-19, there have been research studies that show that medical professionals are more likely to dismiss or minimize our reports of pain. And I want us to just really take that in of not only, it's bad enough when we talk about jobs or housing, but when you're in that vulnerable place physically, medically for your very life, and to not be taken seriously and be sent home and then later die. And so many people then have distrust of medical institutions and interventions as a result of these experiences that I just want to highlight, are not only historical, because most of us have experiences with our relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents can tell stories, horrors that have happened in medical institutions, but also in the present. Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute, Dr. Johnson.
It's because the lawnmower is going outside. Thank you. I have a couple of open questions, and so you can decide who wants to answer. There is a question about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Would you care to comment on that?
You want me to start? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, we're like, yeah.
Well, I think it's important. I think as we talk about this, Dr. Brian Davis mentioned, cultural appropriation in her section as well. And so I think it's around, when we talk about all this stuff, we also have to think about sort of deconstructing and decolonizing kind of everything that we're taking in many ways. So I'll give you a couple, even a couple of just really big examples that I think are we don't talk about a whole lot as much as we should. I think one of them is we talk about like complementary and alternative medicine. And, and that a lot of those techniques and a lot of the things that are being called complementary and alternative medicine and healing approaches, those are things that have been in indigenous and many of our indigenous ancestral cultures for generations and generations. And so I think it's around giving credit and understanding where the intellectual property and rights come from when we talk about certain things. And so I think appreciating that is part of acknowledging and giving credit where that comes from. And I don't think we do that. So even like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like, I don't know how many people have really thought about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, Maslow in 1938 spent time with Blackfoot Nation. And that's what helped him finalize his hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy ends with self-actualization. Blackfoot Nation says that we come to this earth through through divinity embedded in us a purpose. So we come self-actualized. Maslow says we have to go through an entire life and we may never get self-actualized, right? So I think even just that's cultural appropriation. Maslow did not give credit to Blackfoot Nation. Now, again, I'm putting this out there just for us to sort of be thinking about it, but that's cultural appropriation. And I think, to me, culturally appreciating is going like, this is what I've learned. This is where it's come from. This is the contribution of Blackfoot Nation in what we have come to have known as Maslow's hierarchy of need. When we don't do that, and when we want to purport it as our own, or take it and rob people of their intellectual, cultural, spiritual traditions and livelihoods and worldviews, that to me is cultural appropriation. And I think that's part of the challenge. That's embedded throughout a lot of what we do in psychology. And I think, so when we talk about all this stuff, we got to talk about like decolonizing and deconstructing those processes. And that's hard work, but it's necessary. It's necessary.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I would just, add by way of examples, cultural appreciation in practice could be as simple as incorporating proverbs or stories, or identifying people who, let's say you're working with an adolescent client, and they may or may not know someone from their same cultural tradition who has achieved the career they want, right? And so I go and research so they can see, like, this is someone who is this same profession that you want to be, right? And so let's look at their life and how they make that happen. That is like an appreciation. And I had the wonderful experience of, I wanted to try dance therapy. I love dance, I love movement. And the dance therapist was not Black, but she asked about what music I liked and asked how would I feel about, she named some artists that I enjoy, and she put them on. So it was a match for me, so that the music that I was moving to matched kind of my sensibilities, right? Now, an example of the appropriation in a negative sense, I had a client who was Native American who described going to a white therapist who started their first session by like trying to do this ritual that is to be done by like elders of her tribe. So you can imagine, like she was horrified. It was so disrespectful. And like this person who maybe, I guess, read it in a book or saw a documentary, like she did not have the right to do it. We can think about that whole intention or impact. I'm sure she was like excited and thought this will be something to let her know she's welcome here. But you know, she did not have the standing or within the culture or the community to enact a ritual. Now, what she could have done instead is to say, you know, have you ever participated in these rituals and how was it for you? And if you enjoyed it and haven't done it in a while, you may want to think about going and attending another one, right? That would be encouraging her making that connection versus inserting yourself.
Wonderful, wonderful examples. Thank you. Here, there are two questions I think that are similar. And one says, what do you recommend we do if we observe that our clients are avoiding having cultural conversations with us? Or perhaps put in a different way, can you comment on what we can do to take steps to address the passion for not seeing? Now, that may be a focus on the therapist and one on the client, but at any rate, avoidance. So what do you recommend that we do?
Great question. So a couple things came to mind as you asked it, just because I just had a class yesterday, a clinical skills class where this came up, and we were discussing the different reasons that could be happening. And we don't want to assume, because it can be different things that are happening there. One of the pieces that came up is sometimes people are not aware something is cultural because it's just how they grew up. So the example that came, I had a student who was sharing an experience with a client. The client is Chinese American, and he thought a lot of what was happening between the client and the parents was cultural. And the client was like, no, that's just how my parents are, right? And the example that came to my mind is I had a number of years ago, a Middle Eastern American student, and she was saying she didn't realize like the way her family did things was cultural until she was dating someone who was from a different culture. They came over her house for dinner and they were amazed afterwards. They told her it was like choreography, the way at a certain point, all the women got up and got all the dishes and brought them. And then suddenly the men disappeared and he didn't know he was supposed to go with the men. And, you know, and she had never thought about it as being a thing. It's just dinner, right? And so I think sometimes people haven't named it as such. It's just the way we do things. So that can be, you know, what's happening. And then for other people, sometimes they have been raised by parents who kind of taught them to fit in, like to thrive in America or, you know, with white people. You want to let them know you're just like them. You want to let them know there's nothing different about you and that you like everything they like. And so that has for some people been taught as a survival strategy. So if you try to like highlight the other parts of their identity, you'll get the like, no, like, you know, that's not how my family was. That's not how my parents are. And so I would say, you know, whenever anyone is kind of like, no, to try to kind of sit on that side of the table with them, as opposed to like, you know, you must value this. But then for us to, as I sit on this, like join with them where they are, but then to create a curiosity, right? To begin to say, like, I wonder if it would be possible for you to be able to talk about your culture, even if you don't feel that connected to it. I wonder if it would be possible that holding the heritage you hold, even if you don't identify it with a lot, has had an effect on you in some ways. I just wonder, as opposed to like, I'm telling you it did, right? And that can usually create a space for more discourse.
Thank you. There are a number of issues here that are really very broad, and I'm going to take the privilege of just mentioning them because I think they're important. I don't know that we have a lot of time to go into them, but we've had a question that asks that you speak to the issue of the CLAS standards, which I don't know if the audience is familiar, but the class standards, I think, is part of HHS, but it's looking at culturally and linguistically appropriate services. And are there ways to improve it? The questioner wants to know, what do you think is missing? If you think we have time for that, let's go into it. If not, we can formulate a response that can be available later, but feel free to let me know how you want to handle it.
I'll say something briefly about that. I don't know that I'll I'll go into the details around what's missing, or I think in general those 15 standards, it's like anything. I think there's some good information there. I think they provide a nice model. But it's like anything else. Like if our models and our recommendations could change systems, then we'd have a lot less health disparities at this moment in time. I think the challenge is that how do we embedded in our systems hold people accountable and systems accountable for making sure that these things are happening. That to me is the issue. So I think it's like, we can have a lot of models and guidelines and recommendations, and we do have a lot of good stuff that's out there. But from that point to application and implementation and in the systems or in the curricula or whatever it is, there's a huge gap there. And I think it's because we've been telling people, you got to do this, you got to do this. And I think two things. One, I don't know that we are always holding folks and systems accountable to making sure that happens. And then two, I don't think that we do a great job of showing people how to do those things sometimes. And so I think we have to translate our models and standards, whatever we want to call it, into some actionable item steps that really help systems and people begin to implement. Like, what does it look like? Like, I think, hey, it's great, to make sure that you're doing continual assessments and that you're not using interpreters and that there's linguistic match, all those kind of things. But it's like, that's going to look differently across different systems. So how do we take it to another level and go like, what are the things that we need to help people do to begin to implement those? Where's the funding to provide people with support to be able to do that? We tell everyone, you got to do these things. These are necessary. APA even mandates certain things, but I think we don't always help people implement and understand what that looks like. And then we're not holding people really systems accountable if they're not doing it at the end of the day. I think those are some of the issues, sort of more broad issues.
So we need more than lip service or pen service.
That's right. Yeah, I think in many ways we sort of stay at this particular, like we stay up here, and I think we need to dive a little bit deeper at times, and also we need to help people figure out what that looks like, because I think there's a lot of people who'd like to do something. I always tell folks, I think there's inaction fatigue that I think happens oftentimes, not always necessarily talking about some of these issues, but not knowing what to do or how to do it. Or I think that's where it's like, so now what do we do? And I think sometimes that doesn't always happen as well. And again, this isn't everywhere, but in general, I think I worry about inaction fatigue around these issues more than anything.
Interesting concept, inaction fatigue. Here's another big one that I'm going to determine that we don't have time to discuss because I think it reaches the level of another workshop, but I feel compelled to mention it. And that is the fact that race is not real as we consider it. Race is a social construct. And I know that's a teaser, and if you feel pressed to answer it, but I think it's a broad concept that as we delve deeper into it, it could easily take an hour or two, three. I mean, it takes more than that to really address it. But if you want to give a response, that's great. If not, I do have a question to pose to you about assessment.
Yes, I'll just say briefly that race is a social construct with very real consequences.
Okay.
I second that emotion.
That sums it up nicely. We're going to take just one more question, and specifically, this question is about assessment and is looking for some specific information. It says, could the speakers please comment on cultural humility as it applies to psychological testing? Parenthetically, administration, interpretation, norms, etc. So the presentation is addressing the therapeutic angles, but what about the testing or assessment angle?
Yes, I would say it is important to look at who a test was normed on, who it was created for, and to also pay attention to the language, because we can ask the same question and either it means something different to people or it does not attend to context. It's like the difference between hypervigilance and wisdom, right? If you live in an environment where you have to be very guarded, then to pathologize the person is to miss the reality of the circumstance.
And I would just add quickly, Dr. Johnson, I think that all that has to also go in our interpretation, report, conceptualization, recommendation, all that has to be embedded throughout, from the selection of the test, the testing process, the interpretation process, and the report writing process, and the communication of those results in a way that's culturally congruent with what some of the things that Dr. Brian Davis just mentioned as well. And I think that's important.
Oh, you're muted.
You're on mute.
Joe, you're muted. We missed all that emotion.
There's
Joe,
a lot of
you're
good stuff there.
muted.
You're muted, Joe. You're muted, Joe.
Well,